day started like any other at the isolated lake in Maine. The narrator, seeking to escape the chaos of daily life, decided to spend the afternoon fishing. The environment was peaceful, almost surreal, with mist covering the water's surface and the distant sound of birds echoing through the dense forest. He felt relaxed, holding his fishing rod, when something unusual caught his eye. On the other side of the lake, a solitary figure emerged from the trees, carrying a large, rusty metal barrel. The scene felt out of place, as if this presence didn't belong in such a tranquil setting. The man didn't seem to notice he was being watched. He crouched by the lake's edge, opened the barrel with visible effort, and began pouring a dark liquid into the water. The smell reached the narrator even from a distance, a sharp, rotten stench that churned his stomach. Intrigued and uneasy, he tried to observe more closely, but the slowly moving mist obscured his view. Then, without warning, the man looked up. For a moment that felt like an eternity, their eyes locked, as if the man's gaze could pierce the distance and invade the narrator's mind. Instinctively, the narrator stood up, but when he looked again, the man had already disappeared into the trees, taking the empty barrel with him. He tried to rationalize what he had seen. Maybe it was just illegal dumping, an environmental issue and nothing more. Yet, the man's haunting gaze lingered in his thoughts. The lake, once a sanctuary of calm, now seemed to carry a sinister weight, as though something impure had seeped into its waters. As he walked along the trail back to his cabin, the forest around him seemed to grow denser, more suffocating. His footsteps echoed on the damp ground, but soon he began to notice other sounds. A faint snapping of branches here, a muffled rustling there. He paused occasionally, looking back, but never saw anything. Yet, the feeling of being watched was inescapable, as if unseen eyes were tracking him through the trees. The paranoia grew with every step, and he quickened his pace, trying not to give in to panic. When he finally reached his cabin, he locked the door and turned on all the lights. The familiar comfort of the cabin felt different, as if something unwelcome had entered with him. Trying to distract himself, he turned on the television, but the noise seemed insignificant against the oppressive silence that filled every corner. A sense of dread settled in. What if someone was out there, hidden in the shadows? The reflection in the window showed only the inside of the house, but his mind made him believe something was watching from the other side. Hours later, the silence was broken by slow, deliberate knocks at the front door. The sound reverberated like thunder in his ears. "It's me, from the lake," a muffled voice said. His mind raced. How did that man know where he lived? He didn't move, barely breathed, as the voice repeated the same request, insisting, like a dark chant. Only when the knocking stopped did he realize he was trembling. The relief was fleeting because he knew deep down that this was far from over. Tension became unbearable. The narrator threatened to call the police, yelling through the door, but the response was only silence. He thought the man had given up, but later that night, a sound shattered the calm, glass breaking in the living room. He grabbed the gun he kept locked away for emergencies, his hands trembling as he tried to prepare himself for whatever was about to happen. The sound of footsteps in the living room was slow, almost taunting, as if the intruder knew exactly how to heighten the fear. Locked in his bedroom, he called the police, whispering the details of the invasion. The operator tried to reassure him, but he could barely hear her words. Every sound outside made his heart race faster. The intruder seemed in no hurry, as if exploring the house deliberately, intensifying the tension. The narrator knew the man was there for him, and the fear of facing the unknown was almost paralyzing. When the police lights finally illuminated the cabin's exterior, the sound of sirens brought immediate relief. He stayed locked inside until he heard the officers enter the house, their firm commands echoing through the walls. The man was found in the living room, holding a knife. He didn't resist, didn't say a word, just stared at the narrator as he was taken away. Those eyes, cold and empty, seemed to carry a secret that would never be revealed. Police conducted a thorough search of the property and the lake, but the barrel had disappeared. It was as if it had never been there. The intruder was taken in for questioning but refused to speak. He smiled subtly, almost mockingly, as if he knew something no one else did. The narrator explained what he had seen at the lake, but the absence of concrete evidence made it difficult to advance the investigation. The feeling that something bigger was at play began to take root deeply. The officers promised to continue their investigation, but the narrator knew he was alone in his fear. The cabin, once a refuge of peace, now felt like a psychological prison. He couldn't sleep because every sound from the forest seemed to bring back the intruder's presence. The lake, with its natural beauty, had become a place shrouded in mystery and dread. It was as if something had permanently changed in that environment. Before leaving, one of the officers mentioned something that chilled the narrator to the bone. "This lake has old stories, you know. People talk about things disappearing here." Although said casually, the weight of the statement felt like it opened a door to the unknown. The psychological terror was no longer just a feeling, it was a reality he could no longer ignore. Even with the intruder caught, the unanswered questions wouldn't let the narrator rest. He couldn't stop thinking about the barrel, the man's desperate attempts to silence him, and the foul liquid that had tainted the lake. The more he thought about it, the more the theory that the barrel contained human remains seemed plausible. Why else would someone risk so much just to dump something into the water? The man's behavior was too desperate to be explained otherwise. When he shared his theory with the police, they didn't dismiss it but acknowledged the lack of concrete evidence made the case harder to solve. The thought that the barrel had vanished so quickly, as if the lake had swallowed it whole, was chilling in itself. True horror stories often include these elements, a threat that can't be fully explained, leaving fear lingering in the air. The narrator knew his theory might never be proven, but that didn't lessen the weight of his suspicions. He had become part of a horror story as real as any nightmare. The lake was now a haunted place, not by ghosts but by the truths it likely hid in its depths. For him, the greatest punishment wasn't the unsolved mystery but the knowledge that some answers are so dark, they're better left undiscovered. The trip to the lake was more than a tradition, it was a rite of passage. Friends and family eagerly awaited this annual event, a time to disconnect from the world and immerse themselves in the tranquility of nature. The remote lake, surrounded by dense forest, seemed like the perfect place to escape the chaos of modern life. Upon arrival, the group dispersed, setting up tents, preparing fishing rods, and sharing laughter. But as the day progressed, an odd feeling began to creep in, like an invisible shadow drawing closer. While fishing, some noticed that the environment was quieter than usual. The constant chirping of birds, which usually filled the air, had disappeared, leaving only the murmur of the wind through the trees. It was as if the forest was holding its breath. One of the elders in the group remarked that such silence was a bad omen, but the others laughed it off, thinking it was just one of his exaggerated stories. Yet, deep down, everyone felt a growing unease. As night fell, the lake transformed. The golden light of the sunset gave way to an oppressive gray, and the shadows of the surrounding trees stretched unnaturally long. Some tried to light a campfire to dispel the tension, but the wood seemed too damp, and the flame barely flickered. True horror stories often begin this way, with small changes that seem insignificant but foreshadow something far greater. What they didn't know was that this night would bring something they could never forget. Fog started forming slowly, like a white curtain swallowing the lake. At first, the group found the phenomenon beautiful, almost magical. But they soon realized how quickly visibility was disappearing. The lake's shore vanished, and everything around them seemed to be consumed by a void. The silence, already uncomfortable, now felt deafening, as if even the fog conspired to isolate them. The absence of cell phone signal only reinforced the feeling of being completely cut off from the world. Concerned, some members decided to explore the forest in search of higher ground where they might get a signal. The darkness within the woods was almost absolute, and their flashlights barely pierced the thick fog. Every step seemed accompanied by a strange echo, as if someone, or something, was following them. The group moved cautiously, trying not to stray too far from one another. The forest, once just a backdrop, now felt alive, watching, breathing. Along the way, they began finding unsettling signs: claw marks on tree trunks, remnants of objects hanging like offerings, and tracks on the ground that didn't appear human. One of them found a rope twisted with branches hanging from a tree, like an amulet or ritual symbol. When he touched it, a shiver ran down his spine. They all knew something was wrong, but the fear of speaking aloud was stronger. The forest seemed to be holding a secret, and they were about to uncover it. The first sounds began subtly, almost imperceptibly, a crack here, a whisper there. But soon, they became impossible to ignore. A deep rhythm, like drums beating at irregular intervals, echoed through the forest. At first, they thought it was just the sound of breaking branches, but the consistency of the rhythm suggested something deliberate. Their flashlights flickered in the fog, casting shadows that seemed to move on their own, and fear crept into every member of the group. Suddenly, the sound changed. It was no longer just a rhythm but footsteps, quick and almost circling them. Every time someone turned to check, there was nothing there. Then, a scream came. It wasn't human, but it wasn't entirely animal either. It was something in between, a sound that struck their most primal instincts and screamed at them to run. Panic took over, and the group began sprinting back to the lake, but the sounds didn't fade. If anything, they grew closer. When they finally glimpsed the edge of the forest, shadows among the trees began to reveal human shapes. Silhouettes moved, keeping time with the drumbeats. One of the explorers locked eyes with a figure observing them closely, its face covered by a carved wooden mask. The certainty that they weren't alone was now undeniable. They were running for their lives, but the footsteps behind them seemed to draw ever nearer. Reaching the boat felt like a brief reprieve, but the danger was still there, lingering on the shore, hidden in the fog. As the group scrambled to start the motor, a flare was fired, illuminating the forest and revealing something that seemed impossible. More than 10 figures stood aligned at the edge of the lake, motionless, dressed in tribal attire and holding spears. The reflection of their eyes in the flare's light was fixed on the group like predators who had found their prey. The boat's motor finally roared to life, but the sound seemed small compared to the weight of the moment. As they slowly pulled away from the shore, the figures didn't advance but remained still. The group was frozen, unable to speak, their eyes locked on the forest. When a second flare was fired, they saw something even more disturbing. Around 15 figures were now in the water, standing waist-deep, staring at the boat as it drifted away. When they reached the center of the lake, the group finally began to breathe, but relief was replaced by an unsettling question: who were those people? They hadn't pursued them further, but their presence was etched into the minds of everyone there. The night, once a symbol of camaraderie and adventure, had become a nightmare none of them could ever forget. Even after returning to the safety of the city, no one could shake off what had happened at the lake. The masked faces, the glowing eyes, and the drumbeats still echoed in their minds. They shared their story with local authorities, but no one seemed to believe them. That area was known for old legends, tales of forgotten rituals, and unexplained disappearances, but nothing concrete. It was as if the lake guarded its own secrets, protected by the shadows of the forest. A week later, one member of the group decided to return to the lake seeking answers, but he never came back. When the police investigated, they found the boat abandoned and strange markings along the shore. Hanging from a tree was a wooden mask, identical to the ones they had seen that night. The forest felt denser, darker, as if something was guarding that place. For those who survived, the lake became a symbol of something that could never be explained. It was a constant reminder that terror doesn't need to be visible to be real. Some horror stories don't have answers, they simply linger, alive in the memories and nightmares of those who dared to cross their path. It was supposed to be a peaceful morning, or so it seemed. The fisherman, a middle-aged man who found solace in the lake, arrived early, ready for a calm day. The lake, surrounded by dense trees and a lingering morning mist, was the perfect refuge from the chaos of everyday life. While preparing his fishing rod, something unusual caught his attention. On the opposite bank, 3 figures were digging feverishly, throwing objects into the water. The strangers looked odd, their frantic movements and quick glances over their shoulders suggesting they wanted to finish unnoticed. With shovels in hand, they unearthed items from the ground and tossed them into the lake, one after another. The fisherman, curious but cautious, stayed at a distance, observing. He couldn't see exactly what they were discarding, but their hurried actions and furtive behavior sent a chill down his spine. Once they were done, the trio disappeared into the forest, leaving only footprints on the damp soil. Intrigued, the fisherman decided to investigate. Fueled by a growing curiosity, he prepared his fishing gear to uncover what lay beneath the water's surface. Casting his line, he could not have imagined that his peaceful day would soon spiral into a tale of real terror, darker than he ever anticipated. As he reeled in his line, the fisherman felt a heavy weight pulling back. When the object finally surfaced, his breath caught in his throat. It was a firearm, rusted, encrusted with lake debris, and ominous in its presence. The sight of the gun was jarring, a stark reminder that something sinister had taken place in the serene waters. Holding it gingerly, he felt the weight of its potential story pressing on him, as though the lake itself had been hiding a secret for years. Realizing the gravity of the situation, he knew he couldn't handle it alone. He immediately called the police, describing what he had found. While waiting for them to arrive, he sat by the lake, now seeing it in a different light. What was once a haven of calm now seemed to harbor untold stories of terror. The ripples on the water felt like whispers of something hidden, something that wasn't meant to resurface. When the police arrived, they brought specialized equipment to comb the lake. The findings deepened the mystery: a keychain with multiple worn keys, coins from various countries, and a locket with a faded photograph. Each item seemed to carry fragments of forgotten lives, but none offered clear answers. For the fisherman, this was no longer just an unusual day, it was the beginning of a story he wished he hadn't uncovered. The days following the discovery were fraught with unease. The fisherman tried to return to his routine, but every shadow around his house seemed to stretch farther, and every sound in the night carried a hidden intent. He chalked it up to paranoia until one night, low voices broke the silence of his yard. These were not natural noises, they were whispers, human, deliberate, and chilling. Moving carefully, he peered out the window. By the faint moonlight, he could make out 2 figures near the fence, standing still, as if waiting. He froze, his heartbeat pounding in his ears as he tried to process what he was seeing. The fear was paralyzing, but he knew he had to act. With trembling hands, he called the police, reporting the intruders on his property. By the time the officers arrived, the figures were gone, leaving only footprints in the damp soil as evidence. The police conducted a quick search but found nothing else. The fisherman, however, was certain this wasn't a random event. He was being watched, and the connection to the mysterious group by the lake seemed undeniable. Though reassured by the authorities, he couldn't shake the feeling that the danger was far from over. The following days felt like a test of the fisherman's sanity. He tried to continue his life as usual, but the persistent feeling of being watched never left him. Every rustle in the trees seemed louder, every shadow more threatening. The items found in the lake, especially the gun, seemed deliberately discarded, almost ritualistic in nature. It was as if they carried the weight of a story that no one wanted to tell. Despite continued police investigations, no concrete answers emerged. The gun wasn't linked to any known crimes, and the other items, the keychain, coins, and locket, had no identifiable ties to anyone. It was as though each object held an isolated piece of a puzzle that refused to fit together. For the fisherman, the lack of resolution was more unsettling than any definitive discovery could have been. Nights became unbearable. He woke often, convinced he'd heard something outside. The memory of the whispers in his yard, combined with the oppressive mystery of the lake, created an almost suffocating atmosphere. He began to regret ever calling the police, wondering if bringing those items to light had awakened something that should have stayed submerged. With each passing day, he grew more certain that this was far from over. The night that changed everything began quietly, almost deceptively so. The fisherman was at home, attempting to distract himself with the television, when he heard a noise that froze him, the faint creak of footsteps on his porch. Rising cautiously, he approached the door. Before he could peek out, something was slipped underneath it, a weathered envelope, yellowed with age and carrying a faint musty smell. With trembling hands, he opened it to find a single chilling message: "You shouldn't have looked." Panic surged through him as he rushed to lock every door and window. But the feeling of being watched remained. A shadow flickered across the porch, and a low, almost mournful sound reached his ears. Grabbing a flashlight, he shone it into the yard, revealing several figures among the trees. They stood motionless, just watching, their presence suffocating in its silence. By morning, the police arrived to find the house empty. The fisherman had vanished without a trace, leaving only the envelope behind. The case was closed as an unsolved disappearance, but locals began to whisper about the lake. They said that on foggy nights, faint voices could still be heard in the woods, and strange lights flickered by the water's edge, remnants of a mystery that was never truly laid to rest.